Welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to me. I'm back in my chair here in the loft at my house after a little over a week away in Belgium. It was a phenomenal trip. We are going to be doing a stream where I'll tell you everything about the trip, the highlights, the experience, what you can expect from content. Some of you have already seen some of the content. I've uploaded little clips from the battlefields around Ypres. There's a lot more to come. A lot more to be shared, including things from our Band of Brothers tour, 2 days exploring the sites of the Battle of the Bulge. But for today, I want to get back into the Easter Rising. This is going to be episode 3. If you did not see the first 2 episodes to my reaction, the link is in the description. It'll take you back to episode 1. I've also put the link to the original content so you can check them out over at Extra Credits. Let's go ahead and dive in to part 3.
Dublin, April 24th, 1916, Easter Monday. Sackville Street resounds with marching boots as a column of men pass down the major thoroughfare. Some wear green military uniforms, others civilian clothes, but all have guns. Yellow armbands proclaim them to be nationalist paramilitaries, the Irish Volunteers. And marching with them are their leaders, Patrick Pearse and James Connolly. The volunteers proceed to occupy the General Post Office, taking it as a headquarters and stockpiling arms and ammunition there. Then, Pearse reemerges, standing before the building, and reads out a proclamation from the Military Council. It informs the people of Dublin that an armed uprising against British rule is underway, and that this is the first day of a new nation, the Irish Republic. As Pearse reads, gunshots ring out across the city. After years of planning, the Easter Rising has begun.
So let's put this in context of what is happening for the British at this exact moment. They are in the final stages of planning one of the largest offensives of the First World War. The Battle of the Somme is going to begin on July 1st, 1916. That's less than 6 weeks away. They are well into the planning for this. They're getting ready for that. They're laser focused on getting that done, trying to make something happen on the Western Front. They're also fighting in many other places. So their hands are full. Their eyes are on other things, and this is happening in their own backyard.
Thanks so much to NordVPN for helping to keep us safe on the internet. To take control of your internet security with a 2-year plan that's on a huge discount right now, use code ExtraCreditsVPN at nordvpn.com/extracreditsvpn. Despite the chaotic last-minute preparations Irish nationalists made as they decided whether or not to go ahead with their planned rebellion, and how divided leadership meant that not all Irish volunteers were ready or even willing to take arms against the government, the Military Council put their plans in motion. Late in the morning on Easter Monday, 1916, nationalists in Dublin rose up.
So Easter Monday, what does that mean? Because, Easter's on a Sunday. I mean, this is the Monday after Easter. And so I know here in the States, and I'm sure it's probably that way in other places as well, when you have a holiday that falls on a weekend, typically if it's a holiday that involves a day off for a lot of people, like federal employees, like the post office, banks, things like that, usually they'll have the holiday on the Monday following that weekend.
After seizing the General Post Office as their sturdy walled nerve center, they proceeded to take other strategic and symbolic structures throughout the Dublin city center. And by early afternoon, the Irish Volunteers and the smaller organizations assisting them, such as the Irish Citizen Army, had captured St. Stephen's Green, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, the South Dublin Union, the Northumberland Hotel, Boland's Mill, and the courthouse known as the Four Courts. Another group, led by Sean Connolly, not to be confused with the higher-ranking James Connolly, occupied Dublin City Hall, then, as we saw in Episode 1, attempted to rush the gates of Dublin Castle.
So you've got a limited number of people. Your manpower is low, but you can be effective with low manpower if you seize key strategic points. Now, I don't know what this looks like on a map, but I would guess some of these have very symbolic value, but also some of them are probably in strategic places that give them maximum ability to control the expected reaction, because you have to expect you're going to get this surprise. You're going to get the jump on the British authorities, but you can expect that at some point there's going to be a reaction, that they're going to send in the military, and you need to be strategically placed to be able to put that off when it comes.
Connolly raised his gun and killed a policeman guarding the gates named James O'Brien. But the brief confrontation between Connolly and O'Brien meant that the British personnel inside the castle were able to slam the gates shut and keep the attackers out. O'Brien was likely the first death during the Rising, and by a strange twist of fate, his killer Connolly would fall to a British sniper's bullet shortly thereafter, likely the first fatality among the rebels. This was not the only sad irony that day. One of the first British soldiers the Nationalists killed was Lieutenant Gerald Nealon of the 10th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, an Irishman and a nationalist. But he was one of the many who had decided to put aside his political beliefs regarding Ireland in favor of serving the British Army during the First World War.
It reminds me a lot of the fact that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by people who wanted Serbian independence, who were Serb nationalists, and a guy like Franz Ferdinand within the Austro-Hungarian government was probably one of the more sympathetic to their cause. And by killing him, he would have become the emperor 2 years later when Franz Joseph died. They would have actually probably been in a situation much more favorable than the one they were currently in.
But today, that decision ended up putting him in the crosshairs of his fellow nationalists who only saw a uniform. Despite being repulsed at Dublin Castle, the rebels captured fortifications elsewhere. A group seized the magazine fort in Phoenix Park, which they pillaged for weapons and then partially demolished with explosives. The blast echoed across the city, but was not as impressive as the nationalists hoped. Across Dublin, the volunteers set to work, turning buildings into strongholds. They constructed barricades, stockpiled food and ammunition, cleared firing lanes, and erected medical stations.
So they've obviously been working on this for some time. They've laid out their plans. They've decided these are the areas we need to take. These are the things we're going to need. We're going to, they're thinking down the road several steps ahead, which is what you want to do. If this is purely a reactionary thing, people don't think of those things. So this seems to be relatively well thought out. But of course, no plan survives contact with the enemy, in this case, the enemy being the British government. So you don't know necessarily what they're going to do.
To nullify the British authorities' advantage in communications and transport, they cut phone and telegraph lines and bombed railroad tracks. All this dynamism among the rebels was a stark contrast to the lethargy of Dublin's small, largely reservist army garrison. 2 squadrons of cavalry rode into the city center to investigate reports of disruption, but were forced to quickly retreat. Most British commanders ordered their soldiers to stay in their barracks as they tried to piece together exactly what was happening.
Smart.
The sharpest fighting on that first day occurred outside the South Dublin Union, when a patrol from the British Army's Royal Irish Regiment encountered a volunteers' outpost set up just east of the Union workhouse. After multiple soldiers dropped from rebel gunfire, the soldiers stormed the nationalist position and captured it, yet the Union complex itself stayed in the hands of the volunteers.
Interesting that the Union workhouse becomes kind of a focal point of all this. A workhouse is, there's no real equivalent to it in the United States that I could really compare for an American audience, but basically what it was a place for people to go who had nowhere else to go. Almost like a combination homeless shelter and retirement home, nursing home type of thing. But it was a place that was intentionally difficult because what they didn't want was people to just kind of go there as an easy out, right? So if you went there because you had nowhere else to go, because you were poor, because you were homeless, you had to work hard. You were expected to do a lot. The conditions were intentionally really poor so that nobody wanted to be there. But the only people who were there were people who just simply had nowhere else to go.
During the fighting, the soldiers killed a nurse, despite the fact that she was in uniform and clearly a non-combatant.
Wow.
As the sun began to set on the first day, a strange quiet settled over the streets. A rebellion was clearly underway, but the sounds and fury of battle hadn't yet gripped the city. It was almost as though Dubliners had slept through the chaos, though that would soon change. While the volunteers had taken many of their initial objectives, they hadn't been wholly successful. No effort had been made to capture Dublin's twin ports, and the train stations were only briefly under rebel control, meaning the British government could funnel in reinforcements at will.
So yeah, I mean, the ports and the train station, those are 2 huge components when you're dealing with a large empire that has the resources to crush you. You have to secure those things. You cannot give them an easy way to bring in troops and supplies that they're going to need. And you have to move quickly enough that you can make this into a popular uprising, because a small group in one city is not going to stand up to even a distracted version of the British Empire. So you've got to move quick, and you've got to get people on your side, and you've got to do that before they can move these guys in.
Similarly, no one thought to capture the telephone exchange. And once staff evicted from the General Post Office repaired the cut lines, they managed to reestablish communications with the government. So as darkness fell, the nationalists steeled themselves. They'd played their hand and now had no option but to fight. The Shelburne Hotel, April 25th, 1916. The scrape of hobnailed boots echo in the halls, scuffing up the hotel's carpets. British soldiers, newly arrived into the city, usher out the remaining guests and start arming the hotel like a fortress, as well as the neighboring United Services Club. They position sharpshooters and machine gun teams in windows, looking down on the detachment of rebels that have dug in on St. Stephen's Green, and wait for the order to fire. The crack of British Lee Enfield rifles split the dawn. Machine guns rained shots on the green. The nationalists, members of the Irish Citizen Army, return the serve, and soon a firefight rages. Bullets whipping through branches and into tree trunks in the park, and chewing at the stonework of the hotel facade. But the British soldiers have the advantage of height and stone buildings for cover. They drive the rebels from their hastily constructed trenches, and groups of Irish Citizen Army fighters fall back, dragging their wounded with them, though they continue to resist. And this clash is not the only one to rip the morning apart. All across the city, gunfire rises to a crescendo that eclipses the previous day's skirmishing. It was in these early hours of Tuesday morning that the British Army's senior commander, Brigadier General William Lowe, arrived. After a period of early confusion and inactivity, Lowe had decided to personally take a hand in the situation. He summoned reinforcements from across Ireland and mainland Britain.
And see, that's the problem. I'm curious to know what their end game was. I mean, I have to think that they were hoping it would cause a popular uprising. You know, I think of John Brown. Right, in 1859, he storms this armory in Harper's Ferry to get a bunch of weapons, hoping that they can create a slave uprising in Virginia that would spread, right? That was his end game. That was his plan. What was their plan here? Their plan could not have been simply seize a bunch of key points and then wait for the British Army to show up and take it all back. I mean, there had to have been more to it than that. So I looked it up, and it does appear that these risings weren't only happening in Dublin. They were happening in other key cities as well. You might have had 60 people in one spot, a couple hundred in another. And so they did attempt to kind of do this everywhere. So it makes a little more sense. I still don't know exactly what they thought was going to happen. They had to know the British were going to respond in a pretty heavy-handed way.
And planned multiple counterattacks, like the one at St. Stephen's Green. Lowe also deployed an armored train to repair a set of rail tracks that had been damaged by explosives, but the rebels engaged it in a furious 2-hour gun battle at a bridge crossing, forcing the armored behemoth to retreat. But that victory was short-lived. For later in the day, the rebels' fortunes changed in an instant, with a sound that rattled windows throughout the city. Now, before the rising, rebel leaders had reasoned that the British Army wouldn't be permitted to use heavy artillery within the city of Dublin. A capitalist government, James Connolly said, will never destroy property. However, at this moment, the British Army quickly proved him wrong. 4 artillery pieces, 18-pounders, the same type used in the trenches of the Western Front, opened fire in a city full of civilians.
So you got to remember, I think this was a miscalculation on their part. This is 1916. The Great War's been going on for over 2 years. They've seen plenty of cities completely destroyed by artillery. It's also a war in which the majority of battle casualties were caused with artillery. The British Army understood the importance of artillery and how powerful it could be, and they weren't messing around.
First, they shelled an Irish volunteer position thrown up in a residential neighborhood of northwest Dublin. Stunned by the sudden, ferocious barrage, the nationalists fell back, shrapnel and debris raining down around them.
I will say this, and I wonder if, this is me totally speculating here, I wonder if the leaders of the Irish Rising understood, maybe, even if they didn't speak it out loud, that the British would use artillery, and then maybe saw this as an avenue through which they would win more public support to their side. By the British doing this, maybe some people who were otherwise on the fence get pushed off the fence. because they see civilians getting shelled by artillery, and it pushes them to the cause of the Irish nationalists. I don't know.
In the afternoon, Pearse left the General Post Office again and walked to nearby Nelson Pillar, a Dublin landmark dedicated to the British Admiral. And there, he read an address to the gathering crowd. Now was the time, he said. Now was the moment that would make or break not just the Rising, but the fate of the longed-for republic. And he called upon those listening to rise up in support of the rebellion. Almost none heeded him.
And there's your turning point, right? This all only works if the people rise up. If everybody turns against the British government, because it's never going to work if it's just a couple of hundred or 1,000 or 2,000 people. It's got to be the nation. And if they don't rise up, now you're kind of at a standstill. Same thing with I think it's 1832, the one in France that's commemorated in the musical Les Miserables. You know, this was a young group of students who rose up during a funeral thinking that the whole city would rise up with them, and it didn't happen, and they ended up instead being in small pockets, barricaded in city streets, defending to the last. And that's where this is headed now, too.
The people of Dublin had not anticipated the events of the past 24 hours, and most, it seemed, wanted no part in it. In fact, some were outright hostile. Civilians harangued the volunteers and attempted to dismantle their barricades, resulting in rebels opening fire and killing several of them. At Trinity College, the students armed themselves to resist the Irish nationalists and provide a base of operation for the British when they arrived, and Guinness employees turned their brewery trucks over to the British Army so it could use them as makeshift armored vehicles in the coming street fights. And others took advantage of the chaos by indulging in a spree of shop looting, especially in the aptly named Sackville Street. By the end of Tuesday, it was clear that there would be no general uprising, not in Dublin and not anywhere else. The volunteers were on their own, and with most seeing the end approaching, they decided to fight to the last. But little did anyone know, the worst for Dublin was yet to come. Once again.
So that's got to be disheartening if you believe in a cause strongly and you feel like everyone believes in it too, or else they're just waiting for someone to lead, and once you lead, they'll follow, and then they don't. And now you realize that it's life or death and that there's no way out of this for you. That's got to be disheartening. It's got to be disillusioning for you a little bit. So it's interesting to see this unfold this way. And because, I kind of know the end game of all of this, but I don't know all the steps along the way. So I'm learning a lot here. And that's why I'm kind of just throwing out speculation, because I'm seeing how close I am to guessing how this is playing out. But interesting stuff. We've got 2 more episodes that are out, so we'll do those over the next 2 days. I'm headed to Denver. My wife and I are headed to Denver on Thursday. This weekend, I will be announcing more details of it, but I've been asked not to reveal those details yet. But this weekend, there will be a chance for you to meet not only myself, but Mr. Beat, Drew Durnall, some others are going to be there. And we'll be announcing that, but there will be like a fan meetup type of thing happening in Denver this weekend. So if you happen to be in the Denver area, be watching. I will post an announcement about that in the next couple of days when we get a little closer. I've been just asked not to do that until we get closer to it. So tell you the time and place and everything. All right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.